Good morning. We can't hear, just to say. Not sure if there's.
Okay, I haven't been.
Oh,
Can you hear me now that I'm talking? I
yeah.
think we've just been very quiet.
Oh,
We're about
okay.
to
That's
start.
fantastic.
But welcome. Hello.
Thank
Hello,
you. Hello.
online folks. Let's actually start then. Thanks for coming. I'm Catherine Hastings. I'm first presenting, but also chairing. So we've got 4 presentations. Each presenter has 20 minutes to speak, and then we've got some time for discussion at the end. So please hold your questions, maybe write them down so you remember them, and we'll have some questions at the end. I think the light's okay, isn't it? I'm going to be speaking without slides to start with, and I'm going to be timing myself and being very, very honest about how much time I spend. So my presentation is titled Doing Critical Realist Informed Social Science Research, Some Foundational Concepts in Use. Whether acknowledged or recognised by the researcher or not, approaches to social science research are a product of our philosophical foundations. Our presuppositions about the nature of the world, ontology, what knowledge we can have of it, epistemology, and our orientation on the nature of values are all implications for our approach to doing research, or all have implications. Unfortunately, these may seem very abstract or theoretical considerations in many research environments. However, I'd argue that they have a practical impact on all areas of social research. So the identification and understanding of problems, the range of possible answers to a research question, the types of methodologies we employ for the collection, analysis, and representation of our data, and a focus in the context of critical realism, a focus on understanding, or how we choose to focus on understanding versus explanation, and also the role of theory. These are all things that our philosophical ideas will influence, whether we know it or not. And that's the crux of what this presentation is about. How do researchers think about bridging the gap between philosophical principles and the actual doing of empirical social science research? I'm going to start with a quote from the introduction. Oh, hang on. Somehow I've gone right to the end. I'm going to start with a quote from the introduction to the book, Working with Critical Realism, Stories of Methodological Encounters. And this is from the editors, Alpesh Mazura and Grant Banfield. It's well known that critical realism can be bewildering and even overwhelming to newcomers, especially for those without a formal grounding in philosophy. That was my experience. So what resources do we have? First, there are several books that provide knowledge about the philosophy and to different degrees advice on its implications or applications for practical social science research. In addition to obviously Roy Bhaskar and Margaret Archer, authors such as Andrew Collier, Andrew Sayer, Bert Danemark and his co-authors, Wendy Olson, Priscilla Alderson, Peter Ness and Douglas Pauper have all been particularly important for me in developing a critical realist orientated social science research practice. Secondly, there are other authors who've published on their own development of a critical realist method or approach, describing how they did things like literature reviews or qualitative or quantitative methods, or how they developed a critical realist inflected research logic or a project design within a critical realist framework. Some of these people are in the room, which is nice. Thirdly, most recently, more reflexive accounts of the critical realist methodology applied by a researcher to a single project have been published, like the book I mentioned, Working with Critical Realism. And again, quoting from the introduction, this book foregrounds accounts of journeys and experiences, which in turn are used to animate the way that critical realism has been practically and intellectually used to develop research and scholarship that is grounded within a rigorous philosophy of science. And I really recommend that book. It's fantastic. However, my evaluation is that there's still relatively few practical accounts offering concrete advice to scholars about how they themselves can tackle bridging that gap between philosophy of critical realism and its operationalisation within a practical methodology for their own empirical research. So, and in response to a particular research question or a particular or specific disciplinary norm. So back to the question I started with, how can researchers bridge the gap between philosophical principles and the doing of empirical social science research? Now, I could stand here and answer that question purely from my own perspective. For example, at this point in my developer as a researcher and a scholar, this is how I do it. This is how I have done it on one project or another, how I think it can or should be done. And those at the pre-conference got a taste of this, I guess, in my presentation on applied critical realism. And that's fine as far as it goes. But how I do it is not a complete answer to the question. What about how everyone else does it? What can we learn from each other, from those who've bridged the gap in different ways before us that might be more applicable to what we need for our research? So one of my current research projects seeks to answer these questions. Over the past 18 months or so, I've interviewed 24 published critical realist applied researchers. By applied, I mean people doing empirical research, but also some historical or more theoretical research approaches on or about a problem to explain a phenomenon in the social world. That's the connecting thing. That is an application of critical realist philosophy to underlabour some form of research that extends our knowledge about a facet of the social world. I've spoken with researchers in the final stages of their doctoral studies through to all phases of academic life, including those who are being very productive in their retirement. I've spoken to scholars of different genders, disciplinary, cultural and language backgrounds from the Americas, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Asia and Oceania. And I'd like to, although they're not here, offer a shout out to Andrea Maccarini, who hosted me in Padova in Italy, and Lee Price on another visiting fellowship in Lillehammer to enable me opportunities for field work in a European time zone. Otherwise, I would have not had any sleep for quite a while. So what I'm reporting on today is some high-level themes and ideas that have emerged from these interviews. I apologise, but I'm not going to stop to explain any of the critical realist concepts I refer to due to lack of time, which I know is not great. So make a note if I say something you've never heard of and go and find out about it afterwards, or ask me about it afterwards, or someone else. I'll start with some foundational orientating comments, sort of a summation of how critical realism is described in the interviews. Critical realism is a philosophy of science or a meta-theory describing ontological, epistemological and axiological principles. It does not offer a theory of society. Instead, critical realism is a set of foundational assumptions through which social theories, which attempt to explain the world, can be framed and evaluated. According to critical realism, the world exists independently of our knowledge of it, and events, witnessed or not, occur due to directly unobservable but real structures, mechanisms, and causal powers. Causality in the social world is complex, it's conjunctural, reflecting the powers of structures and mechanisms in open systems. Reality is characterised by stratification and emergence. Critical realism conceives of social structures and human agency as two separate but interdependent phenomena with different powers and properties, with society and social forms understood to be pre-existing but reproduced or transformed by human agency. Although espousing a realist ontology, critical realism recognises that our expanding knowledge of the world will always be fallible, socially constructed, historically specific, changing, theoretical. Critical realism also offers frameworks supporting and justifying transformative and emancipatory social science. That's sort of the end of that summary. There are many ways we can develop our critical realist inspired methodologies or our expressions of the philosophy in the way that we collect data, analyse data, represent data in our methods or our methodologies. I'd like to share some of the themes or clusters of comments that people made about that. The first theme is about engagement and wrestling with the philosophy. The critical realists I spoke to talk of factors such as not having a background in philosophy, not having a background in a discipline that is more theory orientated, such as sociology, or not having a theoretical framework that's complementary to critical realism, such as Marxism, as hurdles or impediments for tackling the writing of critical realist philosophy, so the reading of it, and the ideas of key authors such as Bhaskar and Archer. Also, for many that I spoke to, English is not their first language. But to a person, they argue that reading, rereading, and reading again is required and worth it. Repeated encounters with texts, reading other critical realist authors speaking to those texts, attending conferences, engaging in conversations were important in different ways. And for some, but I know only for some, the mentorship of an important critical realist mentor through their thesis advisory or supervision panel. That was more the minority, which is, I think, what we've mostly experienced as well. Many had stories about significant relationships with individuals, mentors or peers, with whom they worked together to extend their understanding through discussions, disagreements, and more formal learning and teaching processes, such as something like the pre-conference that we had earlier this week. But the importance of time dedicated to reading and working through the key texts was a consistent theme. So it's just something you need to do, according to the people I spoke to. One interviewee said, "The more I understand it, the more layers of the philosophy I have access to," being a good thing. So a motivation or an imperative to keep growing in critical realist knowledge. Having said that, it's also important to note that one can do a critical realist study without having read and understood all of the critical realist philosophical literature. The people I spoke with had different parts or aspects of the philosophy that they relied on most, but some commonalities, and that's what I'm going to focus on more today. Whilst many were more orientated towards first wave or so-called basic critical realism, and maybe Archer's work on structure, cultural agency, or the morphogenic sequence, a significant number of others are drawing on Bhaskar's later phases. So dialectical critical realism, meta-reality, but also the writings on interdisciplinarity to motivate their approaches and provide the concepts to underpin their analysis frameworks. From almost all, there was still a curiosity to keep working to increase their knowledge and deepen their knowledge. Asking participants to reflect on the most important ideas for them from critical realism and what impact they've had or what these ideas require their research to look like, I was struck by how much conceptual power these critical realist ideas have for enabling thinking, for enabling analysis, for enabling theorising, and also driving a project's focus, why they were researching a particular thing and for what reason they were doing it, what they chose and for what reason. And in different ways for different people. There's a lot of diversity. But something that's consistent in my data is the centrality of the pillars of critical realism, the so-called Holy Trinity, plus also ethical naturalism to varying degrees, but primarily the force of influence on their work of distinguishing between the transitive and intransitive. So ontological realism, epistemological relativism, and judgmental rationality, these are foundational, powerful, and enabling of a specifically critical realist approach to research. For many, coming to an understanding of the pillars answered fundamental questions for them about why other paradigms just felt wrong and why many existing methodologies didn't offer what they needed for the research question that they had. In the words of one interviewee, so it was just sort of this light bulb moment where like, I need a realist ontology and I need a relativist epistemology, and critical realism brought these two things together. The next theme is that critical realist methodologies are developed with a commitment to depth ontology, responsive to concepts of a stratified ontology in a number of different ways. First, the depth that is captured in the domains of reality. And I know there's been lots of conversations in literature about, are the domains relevant? Are they correct? All I can say is lots of people are basing what they do, and it makes sense to them to do so, on Bhaskars's domains. So the stratification of the empirical from the actual, from the real. This is reflected in the interviews as a foundational ontological understanding that conditions their approach to research. A very clear connection between these philosophical ideas and what they choose to do. So we're required by this conception of reality, if we want to explain anything, to move from description of the events we observe and experience in the empirical to theorise structures and generative mechanisms, the real. A quote from another interviewee. The other huge underpinning thing is the notion of the difference between the real, the actual, and the empirical. I think this is influencing my thinking even more now. Not to mistake that which we can study as that which is. We don't have access to everything. How we approach the empirical will be shaped by the tools that we have, and so our view of what is real will be shaped by the limitations of how we approach the empirical. And it's so important to keep that in mind, that profound limitation of our knowledge. It may be extremely useful and extremely powerful, but it's still limited. And I followed up with, what does she mean by the tools that we have? And the reply was methods and theory, which I think is a great answer. Several people talked about how they rely on Bhaskars's Drake model and the research process described in Danemark and his colleagues, the abstract concrete model. But in practice, that things are iterative, recursive, and messy. So the clear stages are themselves an abstraction of a much more complex process which does not proceed in a linear fashion, but as ways of thinking about an approach, they're very, very helpful. So a critical realist approach to explanation means it's essential to have a critical realist conception of causation, of mechanistic explanation. There's lots I could talk about here, but the key takeaway is that generative mechanisms provide the focus to an inquiry. What is it I need to uncover to find the mechanisms? Where do I need to put my attention? What am I missing? One interviewee said, the idea of generative mechanisms helps me to acknowledge the complexity. And so it brings my mind to thinking not only about this, but about what else? What is countering this? I think it gives me the ability to think in the complexity of, say, the social phenomenon that I'm scrutinising, analysing, exploring, and understanding. Someone else said, I think critical realism, offers a sort of scaffold or framework for making sense of things, to explain things rather than just describe them. I know it's a pretty blunt way of putting it, but it's pretty foundational. I was also really drawn to one account of the importance of looking to explain multiple relevant outcomes connected to the object of research in order to generate a more complex and contingent explanation for it. So not just looking to explain one version of an outcome, but to explain the absence of outcomes as well as their presence, and variegation in outcomes on a spectrum or continuum that speak to the phenomenon of interest. Associated with this point is a recognition of emergence, a sensitivity to being anti-reductionist when identifying the interactive operations of mechanisms and the outcomes they generate. One of my interviewees, when I asked what made her work critical realist and not something else, she said, it has to be realist in one sense. You've got to think that what you're looking for is a real phenomenon in the world. The point is to get that depth of understanding, a depth of explanation for some phenomenon that you're seeing operating at the realm of the empirical. So it's a desire to see those things which are causal, which shape the whole research process. Structure and agency and the models for thinking about structure and agency came up a lot, obviously. The transformational model of social activity, Archer's work, the four-planar social being, taught that these models are talked about as giving, for example, in one quote, giving me access to deeper layers, to ones I didn't have access before. So the idea of conceptual frameworks helping your thinking deepen about something. Another quote, there's a lot of richness in the morphinogenic cycle or in the transformational model of social activity that allows you to think more about the complexity of social change. Finally, there's the stratification between things, what makes something what it is and not something else, the nature of a thing, and the need to be as precise as possible in our structural analysis, the abstraction we do from our data to thinking about what things, objects, or wholes, as Doug called them on Monday, the necessary or contingent relationships define the thing that has the causal powers that we use in our explanations. So a final quote. And maybe this is why critical realism is methodologically so hard. It's talking about the implications of all these things. It doesn't allow a cookbook approach. You have to accept it's an iterative process. So for example, we do the quantitative analysis, we find those relationships, we start looking for the qualitative literature, and then the qualitative literature highlights something we didn't notice in the quantitative, that because we've chosen to code things in a certain way when doing the quantitative work, we've actually reading the qualitative work, we've realized we've put two things together that actually don't belong together. So we need to go back and recode the qualitative work separately or together or whichever way around. And then how does that change the analysis? So it forces you to be a little bit more iterative in your role. I don't have time to go into more detail here, but I'll finish with one quote just to say that, firstly, from a participant, critical realism works as connective tissue. I guess the better I know it, the more I get into it, the more I think about it, the more the tissue is connected. I believe in the power of ideas. I believe in the power of knowledge, not as something that makes me an elite, but something that is powerful, really, to understand the world and to try and bring some change to the world. I think that knowing or having this critical realist understanding allows me to go deeper, to go more deeper into that space of knowledge. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much. So next we have swapping to Nicholas. Oh, you're fine. You have to leave for 2 minutes. I'll just sit here. Yeah, you have 20 minutes in total.
No. Sorry.
That's this fine. Where did you go? Fine, you were in the present. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for being here in the applied version of critical realism. I totally agree 100% with Catherine regarding the fact that we have to bridge the gap between abstract philosophical arguments and how we go to apply this to empirical research. In this line of argumentation, I think that qualitative comparative analysis is a perfect methodology, I would say, that fits and allies with the CR conceptions about causality and epistemology. I will show how. In that sense, in this presentation, I will try not to talk in an abstract way, but I will show you how I applied qualitative comparative analysis in conjunction with CR in interview data. Okay, sorry. Okay. Last one. Yes. This one. Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is the structure of the argument. A few words about what is QCA and how it works. I will present briefly how the QCA uses truth tables. It's a very crucial tool for crafting causal claims, and then I will show the limitations of this tool according to the CR assumptions about causality and finding generative mechanisms. Okay, let's start with QCA. QCA says that in order to make a research, we have to isolate conditions and outcomes in a social phenomenon. Then we have to assure that there are instances where the outcome is present and instances where the outcome is absent. Point 3 is very crucial because conditions, according to the QCA, are sets composed of instances which are assigned the values of 1, meaning the condition is present for a specific instance, or 0, the condition is absent for a specific instance. And another very crucial component of QCA is calibration. Calibration, in more technical terms, means to use theoretical sensitivity and intensive and in-depth knowledge of the material in order to attribute 1 or 0 to each of the instances in the conditions we mentioned before. I decided to present a real example, a fictional example, and then I will present you a real example from my own study. We assume that the researcher has conducted a study in 30 schools. Parenthesis, all the exams come from the educational studies because I work in the educational department. Located in a large neighborhood of a major city in the country, aiming to investigate school violence. The causes identified by the researcher are listed in the columns I will present in the next slides. The first column indicates the school where the observation took place, and the final columns state the outcome. That is the absence or presence of school violence. And the values are 1 and 0. This is not a truth table. This is just the distribution. Here are the schools. Condition 1, condition 2, condition 3, condition 4, and the outcome. We suppose that the researcher has identified these conditions. In the QCA terminology, these are the sets. By the way, QCA draws upon the set theory and the fuzzy sets, but it's very technical to discuss this here. Let's stay to the idea that all these conditions for the QCA paradigm are sets. Okay, we're doing this, and then we construct the truth table, which is this one. How we construct the truth table? The truth table, in fact, summarizes all the logically possible combinations which might be presented. This number is equal to 2k, where k stands for the number of the dichotomous conditions, and this means that two conditions lead to four truth table rows, 3 conditions to 8, 4 conditions to 16. It is suggested that for a qualitative comparative analysis, the cases must not go above the 55. Okay. No, it's this one. Sorry. So an interesting idea from the QCA is that they answer the question, what is a case? And the case in their own view, and I think in our own view, I mean the CR conception of cases, is that a case is the combination of conditions in which an outcome occurs or not, which is case in our case is this one. The combination of these conditions. Okay. And then we have the instances, this one. In other words, QCA has to provide an answer at the end of the research to the following question: what phenomenon is this instance a case of? This is what Reagan calls casing, which is very important for us, I think. Okay. So I think that among others, how the QCA scholars approach causality is similar to how critical realists approach causality. According to the previous slide, we have, if we could see in detail, we could see that we have 8 combinations of conditions, which all of them lead in various and different paths to the same outcome, school violence. Okay, in that sense, social causation in QCA is equifinal, which means different combinations of conditions can lead to the same outcome. Conjectural outcomes result from the interactions of multiple conditions, interaction inside this, and asymmetrical, which is very crucial to notice, because asymmetrical causality means that it is not necessary for the configuration of conditions explaining the presence of the outcome to explain its absence. This is very crucial because in statistics use the notion of symmetric causality. Presence, absence, absence. Okay, I think that these 3 ideas are very close to the critical realist conception of causation. So I pick up a very recent book from Roel Rutten, who is a very known QCA scholar. In his recent book, he presents an example in order to show how a truth table might lead to the discovery of generative mechanisms. In other words, there is a tendency, a paradigm within the QCA perspective, which believes that critical realism and the QCA could combine and join together as a common background, as a common framework. However, in my view, there are 2 critical problems in this approach from the QCA scholars. The first is that conditions are not sets. In their view, sets are identical to conditions, but it is not the same thing for us. Why? Because sets do not present emergent properties with causal power. And second, events, if you can see here, are missing from the construction of the conditions. This is what I mean by saying that for QCA scholars, conditions are sets. In some way, they could be variables. Even though variables are not considered as sets for Rutten and for other scholars in the QCA paradigm. So I think that these 2 problems are very crucial and very basic, and this is why I found that, or better that I suggest a modification of the truth table and in general of the QCA paradigm. The CR alternative, according to my own perspective, is that we have to state clearly the conditions are not sets, and what does it mean for the construction of the truth table. According to Maccarin, Donati, all the known scholars we have read, conditions are relational context in which events happen, and for some reason which the research is going to uncover, specific generative mechanisms produce outcomes. The second thing, which is very crucial for us, is that the cases are wholes, are not just aggregates. From the configuration of its parts emerge properties, which are novel, unpredictable, and irreducible. These three ideas, novelty, unpredictability, and irreducibility, I have taken these ideas from dispositional realism of Mumford, if you have heard this name. So, having this in mind, I will show you how I applied the alternative CR-driven QCA to a practical example. I conducted 20 interviews just for illustrative reasons, okay, with novice teachers, defined as those with fewer than 7 years of teaching experience, with the aim of addressing the following research questions. First, what are the social contexts within the school environment that shaped teachers' emotional experiences? I focused on frustration, anger, and well-being. And the second question was, how do different school-related contexts influence these emotional experiences? Data analysis was conducted by me using the CR-oriented thematic analysis developed by these two authors. I think that you are well familiar with this. This approach differentiates between 3 types of themes: experiential, inferential, and dispositional, which correspond to the 3 ontological levels of experiences, events, and mechanisms. However, I think that the dispositional themes have to be excluded from this type of analysis I will suggest, because the generative mechanisms will be uncovered through the QCA methodology. I will show you then figure 1, which shows the deliverable, the end of the thematic analysis, the CR thematic analysis. What is the deliverable, the end point, in some sense? I have identified 4 relational contexts in which teachers experience anger, relationships with school administration, with colleagues, with students, and with parents. Within each of these contexts, the events corresponding to the inferential themes associated with the activation of anger are highlighted in gray boxes. Conditions, events, experiences. Okay, so simple. These are the end. This is the end result of the qualitative analysis. But we are in the half of the story. Okay. Having this in mind, we can construct the truth table. How? Is it clear, my argument until this point? I think, okay, I repeat, these are the conditions with the relations, and these are the events within the conditions. Okay, how? Okay. First, we have to create a table according to the previous figure, in which relations, the relational context, and these are the events. And then we construct the truth table. Okay, this is the truth table, relations. And these are the instances, the distribution in each case. According to Regin and according to the QCA methodology, we should not expect to fill all these rows because of a phenomenon called limited diversity. Limited diversity means that for some reasons, most of the cases, most of the instances will be distributed in some cases. But I will not go in detail in this idea because it's somehow complicated. But this is a very nice step in order to see the cases, in order to do cross-case comparison. Next step is to do this technical procedure. Yes, okay, I'm finishing. I will not discuss all this. I will discuss only calibration. Calibration is the process of deciding whether an instance belongs to a case. In our case, because in qualitative research, we deal with interviews with ethnographic notes, we do not deal with index as the raw data for us are not indexes because political scientists deal with macro phenomena. In that case, I decided to show you an example of calibration. Calibration, in our case, grosso modo, would be done through measuring the codes. The codes we attribute to each fragment, and then to end, what is the added value of using this? In my view, is that we have the opportunity to theorize necessary conditions in conjunction with sufficient conditions. In this case, you can see. Now I go to the previous. It's okay, never mind. This is I think the last slide. You can see here the combination of the OR means either this path or this path leads to this outcome. This is danger, this is frustration, negative outcomes. If we focus to the negative outcomes, we can create this figure. By doing then abduction, which means theorize necessary conditions here, if you see in detail, are the relational context related to students. The D here means the relation with students, which is a pedagogical relation. And I think that this figure brings to light two generative mechanisms. Identity threatened means that teacher's identity is threatened when a student insults, for example, their work, or a parent intervenes in their work, which is a kind of status loss. When these two generative mechanisms are enacted within events, these two outcomes are experienced. And the final? Yes, it's the last slide. It is shown that when two specific generative mechanisms interact within events which occur in specific conditions, the two separate outcomes are produced. This is in line with the zero-oriented approach to causation, and shows that when novice teacher's identity is threatened, this is the narrative explanation of the generative mechanisms. Okay. This is my point that I would like to make regarding how we could provide an answer to how we could justify our intuitions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michaelis. And I need to find this. Julie. I'll give you a 5 and 10.
Fantastic, thanks again.
Thanks, Julie.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Julie Monroe. Thank you for the opportunity to present this paper, Theorizing Social Relations in a Customer Services Setting via Social Positioning. So the paper today, it reports on my PhD data collection. I finished my PhD 3 years ago in 2022. And sorry, I also meant to thank Centre for Critical Realism for supporting me to attend this conference. So the paper today, it's about empirical application of some realist social theory, and that I'm particularly interested in, which is social positioning theory, which I will introduce some of the aspects of that. For some of you may be familiar with social positioning theory, and some of you less so. So I will give you some information that's necessary to understand how it works. So So the context of this paper is a frontline customer service centre in a large city in the northeast of England, and the service which I'm employed by. So I work in this service and have worked in this service for a long time. And it's part of a much larger set of council services. So in the UK context, these are services which are offered by local government to help citizens to, for example, around issues to do with housing and schools and social care. So it's a public sector context that I'm talking about. And the picture is from the old customer service centre, which no longer exists. And so just to talk a little bit more about the context. So in my role as a customer service assistant, I support customers to engage with a range of services, many of which increasingly are online. For example, universal credit, which is it's one kind of welfare in the UK context. So we're helping citizens, also some of whom find it difficult to navigate increasingly online only and digital by design services. So part of my job is to help to signpost people, and it might be to services such as debt management. The work that I do is quite low status, so I work in a large work group at the lowest level in the organisation, and the work is quite low status, poorly rewarded, and typically what you would think of as a working class job. The work group is around 80, and it's a diminishing service. So in the UK, public services are, typically diminishing for obvious reasons. So I began working at the Customer Service Centre in 2015, which was 1 year prior to beginning the PhD. And I worked there 0 hours and maybe 3 or 4 shifts a week. And working there has allowed me to document the many aspects of customer services work. And just to kind of mention about the sample a little bit. So my work colleagues, and this is to do with like my snowball sampling from my wider PhD data set. So I didn't only interview my colleagues, and this was just a kind of a feature of snowball sampling. But when I did interview my colleagues, they tended to be predominantly like me and be middle-aged and working class women. Many of whom entered work at a time of more stable employment, and some of my colleagues have never worked anywhere else apart from in this customer service context. So what I'm trying to do here is go back between empirics and theory, so not for this to be completely theory kind of laden, but to try and go back to the empirical context. So briefly, and I will read some of the information from the slides just to introduce social positioning theory for anyone who's not familiar with it. So social positioning theory has just 2 principles that can be iterated over and again in processes of social constitution. And I'm citing Lawson here, and Lawson is one of the, well, certainly the key figure in Cambridge social ontology, which is where social positioning theory has come from and is associated with. In any case, the social positioning that I'm talking about today. So in an emerging system, a space is created that is structured in a manner to orient any person or thing allocated to it to serving some system function. Secondly, a person or entity is allocated to the space created, thereby becoming incorporated as a component of the totality or system in a manner oriented to serving a function of the wider totality. In the simple relational formulation, there is a social position and a position occupant, such as employees in the workplace, for example, or students in a university. And position occupants obtain rights and obligations that are positional. So in terms of the focus of my paper, it is on rights and obligations, which is one aspect of the theory. And that's what I'm trying to develop and make a contribution around with this particular paper. So my PhD relied on social positioning theory. I've published a paper which more generally talks about rules. It doesn't focus so much just on rights and obligations, which is what I'm trying to develop here. So the purpose of this paper is to empirically test a discrete aspect of social positioning theory, namely the social relation constituted by paired rights and obligations. And I'm drawing on an interview with my manager in this paper, which explores how power and occupational class determine the usage of digital technologies in a customer services setting. And I do this to achieve a more complete causal account and deploying realist causal explanation as the analytical strategy. I respond to the challenge of theorizing social relations using theory in which social relations are understood through processes of social interaction. Moreover, this approach makes it possible to evaluate parallel objective contextual differences in participants' experiences and provides a conceptual resource for analysing qualitative data. Keep going. So later on, I do have a worked example from my empirical data, which should hopefully illustrate better what particular rights and obligations might be in a particular context. But first, so in the relational framework of the social realm, rights and obligations are always internally related. And this from Lawson 2019. Matched rights and obligations constitute a fundamental form of social relation, organising those so related as components of the community so formed. They work as power relations in that the exercising of a position, right by one party leads to another with a corresponding or matched obligation, doing what is requested or expected, even if the latter feels it is the last thing he or she wants to do. And where individuals share identical positions, community membership, the accruing rights and obligations are widely shared, so that, for example, all employees are expected to attend work on time. In the context of this paper, my research questions are: how can social positioning theory help us to better understand individuals' different allocation to class positions? So I'm particularly interested in occupational class positioning. And also, how can social positioning theory help us better understand differential classed outcomes in employment relations? So I mentioned briefly that my subject is to do with digital technologies. I explicitly didn't introduce it too much at the top because I think it does become clear through the presentation, and not to spend too much time talking on the phenomenon. But in my PhD was all about a phenomenon that I call work time domestic labour. And it's a phenomenon that's wherein people are doing their work at work. So in one sense, they're doing empty labour or non-work, which is a sanctionable activity. Certainly where I work, it's a very sanctionable activity to do not work when you're at work. So people would go to great lengths, myself included, to avoid being seen to be doing non-work or empty labour. But of course, the phenomenon of work time domestic labour, is arguably it's ontologically very different from non-work, but it has some similarities. It could be the employer might mistake the two for the same thing. Let's say. Okay, so this is a nice overview of social positioning, which is from Faulkner and Rund, who are Cambridge academics who have theorized social positioning of digital objects. And just to reiterate the whole idea of social positioning, really, so the guiding idea is that in being assigned a position within some system by some community, an entity acquires the social identity associated with that position. A social position is a specific status within a system that locates its occupant as a component of that system. The social identity of any entity is then the kind of thing that entity is by virtue of the social position it occupies. Social positions typically exist independently of and usually prior to any individual occupant, something which therefore applies also to the identities they inform. And I kind of include that just to underline the idea that in social positioning, artifacts can be theorized, alongside of, for example, within the human communities in which they exist. So the theory allows accounts of the technology. So this is the example that I mentioned. So I said that I'd interviewed my manager as it happened. So as I was, collecting interviews during my PhD, I interviewed quite a lot of my colleagues, and I found it quite easy to approach, relatively easy to approach my colleagues with the same status as me to request interviews. But eventually I kind of got up the courage to ask my manager for an interview and was very surprised. I was nervous about it and I was very surprised that he agreed to it. But he did. So some of this this material is kind of coming from the opinions that my manager was expressing when I've been asking about various things. So I'll run through this really quickly and then take a side step. So if we were to think of the rights and obligations in this context, to myself as a customer services assistant, which is the bottom rung of the organizational hierarchy, and my manager, who I'm calling Frank, who would be at that top level of the organizational hierarchy that I work in. So my rights would be to use workplace network technologies, including internet, to complete work tasks. And my obligations would be to follow guidance contained in the employer internet use policy, which proscribes work and non-work usage. So I'm very familiar with the internet use policy at my work. Obviously, it's of great interest to me, and because of my study of my topic. And so in terms of Frank's rights and obligations, he has a right to investigate my usage of workplace network technologies where this is suspected to be illegitimate. And I should mention that this whole kind of investigation that I began with the PhD came about because one of my close colleagues was sanctioned for their non-work internet use. And then subsequently, 3 of my other colleagues were sacked for technology misbehaviour in the workplace. So I was quite close in a context to people who were being sanctioned quite severely in some cases for illegitimate use of workplace technology. So Frank has the right to investigate my usage, but also he has an obligation to follow an organisationally recognised due process. And we work in a public sector organisation where there are due processes. I couldn't just be sacked one day. I would have to do something quite bad for that to happen. So there's this due process which Frank would be obliged to follow, and that would include human resources. And in the next example, I have a right to transparency within this kind of event, to fairness in relation to any investigation, and I would have access to trade union representation because I'm a member of a trade union which is active in my work context. And then but I would also have an obligation to participate in an investigation, and this might include disciplinary meetings with organisational representatives such as HR. And I also had quite a lot of insight into these kind of processes through my colleague and friend at work who went through this whole process of being investigated and what that process kind of looked like. And I also have done an interview with them. And then finally, Frank would have the right to end my contract of employment potentially, but he would also at the same time have to follow a due process in relation to ending my employment, should that happen. Perfect, thank you. That is perfect. So, what else would I want to say? Yeah, I want to think about what the potential contribution is going to be from this, which when I began sketching this out, I really wasn't sure there was like much of I wasn't clear what the contribution could be. But so in this example, the rights and obligations described, they result from authoritative declarations. So in social positioning theory, it's already well understood the difference between informal and formal rights and obligations. And these are some which have been written down, such as the Internet Use Policy. That's a formal authoritative declaration. And this is the way in which the rules have been codified and can be understood. But typically, rules in the social environment are not written down, even in a workplace. So, for example, whether I can carry my smartphone with me at work or not, this is not written down anywhere, but it is a rule, and I should not, in the past, I should not have carried my smartphone with me whilst in the customer service environment, which is always a public and customer-facing environment. So I'm not sitting in a back office somewhere answering the phone. I'm standing like here waiting for customers to arrive and ask me questions. So you can imagine that maybe smartphones would not be allowed in this kind of context. But when we think about more informal rules, such as this one, Lawson describes these are those which emerge spontaneously through general human interaction, with rights being implicit in certain widely followed individual actions, and with obligations manifest as norms of human activity. So I think the potential for the contribution, perhaps for me taking this forwards, is in the difference between formal and informal rights and obligations and how these are codified. So maybe I'm going to move forward using those ideas. Yeah, I've lost my train of thought a bit. Yeah, so sorry. So just to finally come to the conclusion. So I haven't had another example, which I mentioned smartphones as being an example where I've never seen that written down anywhere where I work, whether I should or should carry a smartphone, but it's understood. So it's understood, it's norm. It's like a norm within the environment where everyone just knows that you should not. And then when I interviewed Frank, I asked him about that and said, what do you think the reason is that we should not carry our smartphones at work? Is it because it's mainly because it doesn't give a good impression, right? So if you come up to the desk here and ask me a question, I'm like on my smartphone. This is not like giving a great example. It's about impression management, is one thing. But I think I can probably examine in my own experience. So pre-COVID and post-COVID, things have changed and shifted in relation to the smartphone usage at work. So let's think, so in the last 5 years, and maybe if I can document this shift, thank you very much, I'll wrap up shortly. Maybe if I can document this shift, this might be one good example in a paper to kind of explain these, how informal rules, which are normed in environments, can shift from one thing to quite a different thing. So during COVID, when we were at work, we all had this app, where a tracker app, which would tell you if you came into a close proximity with someone else, and if they subsequently tested positive for COVID, you get pinged on the app and you'd have to self-isolate. So this kind of technology, I think, was a turning point in my workplace. So we were back to work, but things were still during COVID. So everyone's like starts to carry their smartphones. They can justify it because of the app. So we need to carry our phones because we need to be able to be tracked. And then things have just changed also subsequently, where if a customer comes to me and says, oh, the Wi-Fi is not working in this building, what's wrong? If I have my phone in my pocket, I can say, oh no, the Wi-Fi is working, let's find out and this kind of stuff. So yeah, that would be potentially a contribution. And I'm not really going to mention this, but just in terms of the process of inquiry and working backwards. So again, social positioning theory, as it's been developed at Cambridge by Cambridge Social Ontology Group, it's a really, really rich, a very rich resource, which offers a lot for the researcher in terms of method and theory. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much.
Julie, thank you. Our fourth presenter is online. Marcin, are you there? Yes. There you are. Hello, welcome. It's very difficult for me here to give you any time feedback. So you have 20 minutes to present. If you start to go over 20 minutes too much, I'll come online and actually talk to you. But if you can keep an eye on time, otherwise I'll have to, it's hard to show you how much time you have left from here. Does that make sense? Probably not. I don't think it made sense to me. Because you can't see me, you need to look after your time. But if you get too much over 20 minutes, I'll come back onto the microphone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the conference on the panel. My name is Marcin Zarzecki, head of the Department of Social Research Methodology and Statistics at Kardynal Stefan Wyszyński University in Warsaw, at the Faculty of Social and Economic. Okay. The issue of class variability is one of the key topics in contemporary social and economic theory. Question about subclass relation.
Sorry to interrupt you, Marcin. Do you have slides that you would like to share?
No.
Oh, that's all right then. No problem. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Question about how class relations are transformed, what mechanisms sustain or decompose social hierarchies, and how to interpret these processes in the context of the global economy require a solid methodological foundation. Critical realism developed by Roy Basker as an alternative to empiricism and constructivism offer a framework for integrating the structural level and agency, material facts and ideas, as well as social relation and their conditions. Unlike positivism, which focuses on observable phenomena, and constructivism, which emphasizes socially constructed meanings, critical realism assumes the existence of deeper mechanisms that generate observable phenomena. This also applies to class relations, which are neither solely an income category nor exclusively the result of class consciousness, but rather the result of dynamic, historically rooted social and economic mechanisms. In classical sociology, class structure was described in material terms by Marx as the result of production relations, and by Weber as a combination of income, prestige, and power. However, in the era of late capitalism and the transformation of global labor system, such a reduction proves insufficient. Critical realism allows us to transcend dualism, micro-macro, structure agency, material symbolic, offering a stratified reality approach in which different levels of reality are ontologically distinguished but interconnected. Basker distinguishes three levels of reality: observable reality, actual reality, events, and real reality, underlying mechanism. From the perspective of critical realism, class change is not merely a statistical phenomenon. It means the activation and transformation of specific social mechanism. For example, the transformation of the working class into precarious conditions in neoliberal capitalism can be understood as the result of the interaction of several mechanisms: labor market deregulation, political and institutional mechanism, redefinition of professional identity, cultural mechanism, blurring of the classic form of class solidarity, social mechanism. Okay, this interpretation allows for a multi-level analysis in which we not only observe the symptoms, decline in social mobility, but also attempt to identify their causes. Now, one of the most important phenomena of contemporary class transformation is the emergence of the so-called precariat, a class categorized by unstable employment, economic uncertainty, and social exclusion. They Standing, who popularized this concept, treats the precariat as a new class formation, different from the traditional proletariat in terms of both production relation and collective identity. However, the concept itself often operates on a descriptive level. It describes symptoms without reaching their deeper causes. Critical realism allows us to explain the origins of the precariat by identifying the structural mechanisms that generated its emergence. This includes, among others, the globalization of labor markets and the resulting pressure from employment flexibility, neoliberal welfare state reforms that have limited access to social security, the transformation of education system that no longer guarantees social mobility. The precariat does not exist on the surface of social reality. It is not merely an empirical category. Its existence is emergent in nature. It arises as a result of complex interactions between economic structures, institutional norms, and the subjective experiences of individuals. It is precisely the concept of emergence fundamental to critical realism. Critical realism rejects both methodological individualism and total holism. Class changes are therefore not only statistical processes, an increase in the number of people in the middle class, but transformations in the system of social relations. For example, the redefinition of the middle class in the context of the financialization of the economy can be understood as the result of the shift of centers of capital accumulation from production to the financial sphere, changes in consumption patterns and social aspirances. Growing debt as a mechanism masking the real impoverishment of this group. Such analysis require an understanding of classes not as fixed categories, but as processes, dynamic, contingent, and dependent of historical context. The application of critical realism to the study of social classes also requires consideration of global economic structures. The global economic system is not merely a backdrop for class processes, but actively constitutes them. According to the Basquiat approach, social mechanisms are contextual in nature. They are rooted in specific spatio-temporal conditions, but at the same time have the potential to operate beyond local system. The concept of Immanuel Wallerstein, World Economic System, and Samir Amin, Center Periphery, indicate that class structure depends on the place of a given economy in the global division of labor. From the perspective of the critical realism, we can interpret this as a manifestation of geopolitical and economic mechanisms that co-create local class formations. For example, the middle class in peripheral countries is often based on employment in the public service sector and the export of cheap labor. The working class at the center of the global economy is being reconfigured by automation and relocation of production. Financial and technological elites operate according to a trans-class logic. They are part of global. From the perspective of layered ontology, this means that class relations must be analyzed at least 3 levels: local, access to the labor market; national, tax policy; and global, mechanism of capital and institutional power transfer. According to the critical realism approach, classes not only exist as structural entities, they also have transformative potential. Bhaskar develops the concept of emancipation as the goal of social science. Understanding the structure and mechanisms of social reality should serve to change them towards greater freedom and justice. Critical realism makes it possible to understand class not only as a position in a structure, but as a potential for collective agency. This shifts the emphasis from classes as status categories to classes as historical actors. Critical realism as a meta-theoretical basis for sociology and economics point to the need to transcend of the dominant paradigms of class research, both those based on simple positivism and those rooted in constructivism. For empirical research, this means the need to use mixed methods which enable the identification of both observable manifestation of classes, income, professional status, lifestyle, and the deeper mechanism of their reproduction and change, institutions, ideologies, ownership structure. From the point of view of social and economic policy, critical realism offers an approach based on the diagnosis of systemic mechanisms rather than just their superficial effects. For example, the fight against poverty cannot be limited to cash transfer, but must take into account a mechanism of structural exclusion. Education policy should focus not only on skills, but also on the redistribution of cultural capital. Economic planning should take into account not only growth indicator, but also processes of disclassification and labor market segmentation. In the face of growing inequalities, labor market fragmentation, and social polarization, reflection of social class takes on new meaning. Critical realism allows us to move beyond of the binary oppositions present in many social theories: structural agency, material, symbolic, objective, subjective. It proposes an approach that not only describes class changes, but also explains them by identifying the emergent and contextual mechanism. In the era of late capitalism, where social processes are often hidden under a layer of linguistic constructions, ideologies, and statistics, the need for realism became not only an intellectual preference, but an epistemological imperative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcin. We've got quite a bit of time for questions and discussion, which is fantastic. We've got one microphone for using in the room. Can I encourage maybe the people who spoke to sit quite close to the front
Okay,
and to come up and use this microphone at the front to respond to the questions, and that way we can use
okay.
the roving one in the room. So I'll open it up for questions, obviously, to any of the presenters. Please just let us know who your question is for. If you have a question online, can I ask you to use the hand raise symbol, and I'll keep an eye on that. And if anyone in the room sees something I haven't seen, please let me know. That would be great. Are there, first of all, any questions from people in the room? Start with. Okay, I've got to take the mic up the back. One moment, please. Oh, you.
Hi, so it's just a quick question to Catherine and then Travis as well. Catherine, I mean, we talked about this before, so I also understand that the whole focus on the bridging the gaps. But it's a more like a kind of comment that I want you to reflect upon. In one sense, in critical realism, perhaps if we want to really be critical, this gap should exist. Meaning, like, if we're taking the ontological depth seriously, this movement from philosophy to the empirics, let's say, of social sciences will always be difficult. And actually, us as critical realists, we should always theorize it in the sense that they cannot be reduced to each other. So even though I understand your intention behind the word, but I would like to make it's just a comment and see what you think. But perhaps maybe given this complexity and difficulty, perhaps another way to put it is, because I do share the commitment towards operationalizing further the research, but rather than gaps, because I would argue those gaps need to be there between philosophy and social science, perhaps we could entertain building bridges. And by doing so, it is not only in one way, because we normally talk about them as building bridge from philosophy to social science research. But actually what is very important for us as critical realists, I would say, is the way back. We have to, I mean, if it is still going to be informed by philosophy, right? Otherwise, why are we in the school? The bridge is not only going down, but it's also about building the bridge. So I just wanted to I mean, we talked about this before.
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
if
yeah.
you could reflect a bit more about it.
Yeah.
My second question, very quick to Michaelis. So are you saying, so it's a bit maybe, are you saying that by critical realizing the QCA, are you saying that you are moving then from an Enos to a Suim? That would be a critical realist interpretation would be a Suim in that sense? Because if I got you right, the original model is more of a celebration of an Enos condition, correct? So is your, yeah, so basically that's my question. Is your proposition is to transform it into a Suim? If this is the case, could you further elaborate on that? Because Suim also has its own type of method. But yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
I'll just respond first to say, yeah, I think it's a metaphor, and it's like when we talk about laminated systems, we don't actually mean that there's hard, fast edges to the laminations that make up a stratified ontology. So I think it's also a point of view thing, because in the interactions that I have and in my own experience, it feels like trying to find a connection, trying to find a bridge. And I think whether we talk about it as bridging a gap or making bridges or some other metaphor, it's still, in my point of view, I still feel there is a distinction, and maybe that's ontological thing again. There's a distinction between the levels of meta-reality, of meta theory, of social theory, of methodology, of so how we do things, but they still by necessity need to be connected in the same way that we talk about, I mean, it's a very different scale of something, but structure and agency being two distinct things, but absolutely interconnected, and we analytically separate them in order to better understand the wholeness of their relationships. And I think in doing research that applies a philosophy, there's a similar kind of process of needing to both keep the totality of this is critical realist in all its in both its abstractness but also its operationalized form. But in order to do those things, we analytically separate and ask meta questions about what am I doing, why am I doing it, how am I going to do it, and that to answer those questions, we sometimes need to think, well, what does the philosophy say? How do we then interpret it in order to operationalize it? So yeah, I think it to me, it's like a metaphor. It's a point of view question, and it's that same thing of by saying it, you now by abstracting and trying to give a metaphor to something, you can take some of the features out which make it actually what it is, but you do it for a purpose and hopefully in conjunction with other information that makes that clear as a possible problem. Yeah, that would be my answer. Would you like to have a?
Yes. Thank you for the question. Very crucial. I think that the most important thing is not to take sides between these two, Aenus or Swin. I think the most crucial thing is to theorize the interaction of generative mechanisms. The crucial thing in my approach to QCA is not Aenus or Swin, but to take into account events. This is the crucial thing which QCA scholars do not even take into account because they think that conditions, sets, events, and variables are the same thing. This is the crucial thing because if we can identify events, then we have the opportunity to bring to light generative mechanisms. In my example, it happened by chance that I had the Swin condition. This was a good luck for me, but in other research, I may have Aenus condition. In that case, the point is how researchers implement retroductive reasoning. This is crucial thing. Thank you.
Alice. Rick, online, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thanks to everyone for their presentations. Mainly a question for you, Catherine, I think, or two questions. One is, what are you planning to do with the data you have? I found it quite motivating to stick with critical realism, given the sort of quotes and views that you obtained. So I'm sure you're wanting an academic paper out of it, but I think a blog or something or a webinar would be really helpful for people who are struggling with critical realism. The other thing is, I wondered if you'd be interested in doing a follow-up study. I think some of the people who reject critical realism have engaged with it, so they're not just ignorant of what it's about, but have decided it's not for them. I think there'd be some really interesting interviews there. I think the main thing I hear is that sort of sneaking positivism in through the back door, and that's why they've rejected it, but others may have different experiences. But yeah, two questions there.
Yeah, I think, Rick, your second question is a very critical realist question. You know, what are some other possible outcomes given the same conditions? And in answer to your first question, we were chatting, Steve Ash and I were joking yesterday because there's a thing in Australia called a Dorothy Dixer question, which happens in Parliament. So when someone in my party asks me a question in question time so that I have an opportunity to say something I didn't have time to say during my presentation or my speech, and you've just given me this perfect opportunity, even though we didn't talk about it. So the interviews are part of a bigger project for a book for Routledge on developing critical realist methodologies. What I didn't have any of the time to do today is more about how people articulate the ways in which, I mean, I got to it in general terms, but more specifically how the different researchers articulate the bridging the gap, so how they think about what the implications are in very specific terms, in terms of how they use methods, how they think about data representation, how they think about, when I say methods, both data collection and analysis methods, how they think about what data is able to do, how they think about social theory and how social theory and different levels of social theory work in their projects. So the bigger and smaller questions of project design and the meta questions. And so what the book will be about is different ways that people do it. So trying to kind of get inside that black box, which we don't usually have the time to show explicitly in our journal articles, for example, with the aim that it is supportive, but also increases people's confidence to think that they can do it too, and that the investment is worth it because of the payoffs that it gives to what we can achieve in our research, the potential for richness, the potential for better explanation, that kind of thing, the potential for emancipation and social change.
When do you think the book will be out?
No. Yeah, Robin just said, oh, when I've written it, as the answer. I have a contract that says there's a manuscript at the end of December. But it's my big focus for the next 6 months, I'll put it that way. So sometime, because there's a process after that as well. Yeah, but it's a happening thing. One more question. Yeah, a question in the room first. Christina, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you so much. Yes, and thank you to all the presenters for very interesting presentations. My question is for you, Catherine, and I very much agree with what you said, both in the response to Grim's question and in your presentation, because theory and praxis is like a dialectic continuum that they depend on each other. So of course we need more knowledge about how do we apply philosophy in praxis, because that's the whole reason that we need to learn more about the world we live in, and it's a perfect way to do it. And in line with that, I remember last year's conference that Ismail Lavanoudi, he had a comment or a point about in organization studies that no one's explaining their ontological background, because that's not part of the journals, that's not the focus. So I was wondering how the critical realist community can support filling this gap, to use the metaphor, because one thing is theorizing, but another thing is seeing how critical realism can actually change the world. But if none of the applied journals care about critical realism, how can we make our work and our possibility to change the world, how can we make it more obvious at this point? Because to me, it's as if the Journal of Critical Realism is very much focused on the philosophy and on theorizing. But how can we as critical realists show the world the change that we actually make when we conceive the world the way we do? And do you have any?
Yeah, and this came up quite a lot in the interviews, because one of the questions I was asking was about writing. Like, is there something about the critical realist principles that you hold that impacts on your writing? And what came up a lot was audience and who the audience is. And there were some interviewees who said, look, it depends, but I really don't talk about it very much in a lot of places. And there are other places where I talk about it very deeply, and it depends on the audience. And then someone else said that the way that we approach explanation and the quality of explanation, it actually should be the goal of all research. Like, reading a paper that stops at the output table is so frustrating. So that by providing good examples of good research, in the sense of research that does have rich but one person used the word parsimonious, and I think that's quite useful. So rich explanation, but explanation that has a clarity of focus and is actually giving us something we can use, because it's abstracted, and or there's enough like we were talking about yesterday, and then Karen's talk, enough information left out in order to make what's there speak, but without leaving out stuff that then makes it misrepresent how we understand reality. I'm not really getting to the point very quickly here, but I think there's something about being pragmatic, like not pragmatism in a paradigm sense, but showing through our work. I guess that's what I keep coming back to, and in different forums what's possible. But I would always say that my work, even if I don't go into it in detail how or why, I would always say that my work is under this umbrella, even if I don't spend a lot of time in the paper talking about that. Although I would usually try and bring things in as much as I can, because not my belief, but some way of saying, in the ontological framework in which I'm using, reality looks like this, therefore blah blah blah. So it's at least woven through it, even if it's not a big part of the paper that says, and here I've hammered onto my 10 things on the door kind of. Yeah. It's not a great answer, except that there's variation. People do things differently. And people that I think of as being like critical realists on a podium kind of pillar, I don't really talk about it much when I write for sociological journals. I talk about it in critical realist journals, but it just sits there underneath as an underlabourer in other places. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for the growth of the community and people's realization of the role of critical realism in our work is another question. Yeah. Online, who's next? Brendan. Hello. From Australia.
From Australia, mate.
Australia.
I'll try and keep the strine to a minimum.
Excellent.
Question for the panel, whether it's, how would you teach critical realism to someone who has never studied it, looked at it before, is scared of it, doesn't have a supervisor who's versed in? How would you teach either critical realism, or how would you teach the methods that you have talked about today to up and coming doctoral students, master's level students?
Someone else? Like Michaelis, do you want to have a go at that, or?
Yes. This is a very important question and very practical. And in my view, in Greece, I teach in a department, pedagogy department. Pedagogy students are not aware about these things. So the first thing I'm trying to do is not to scare them, is not to provide them the philosophical background. I go practical. What problem would you like to study? And then I'm trying to present the critical realist basic ideas step by step. And I think that if this could be done in guidance, I mean, I guide the PhD students or the master students to critical realism step by step. I have not yet seen the results, but I hope that they will combine in their research what they would like to do theoretically and the critical realist perspective, because I think that critical realism has to bring in dialogue with other currents. In that sense, I could not interrupt the preference of a student to follow, for example, the constructivism or the linguistic approach to the problem, but I'm trying to combine this practically. I have no answer.
Marcin, do you have anything that you'd like to add to answer that question from Brendan? I can't see you, so I don't know. Please interrupt if you do. I'll just say that I don't have a straight answer, because last night at dinner, 4 of us, 5 of us were sitting around one end of the table talking about, you know, what should the pre-conference look like? Who is the pre-conference for? What should be the things that people take away from the pre-conference? What are the pedagogies that are best suited to teaching or learning, in fact, learning the philosophy? What bits of the philosophy in a 2-day workshop are most important? And as we've just been talking about, not just learning the philosophy, but developing confidence in how to use it in doing applied research in practice. And we didn't have an answer, except that we noted, she says with great subtlety, noted how many people at this year's conference are engaged in some way in teaching and learning, in education, and that, you know, there's potential here to do some work together, to have a little side project which is about the learning and teaching of critical realism, particularly in the context of how it can be operationalized in research. What's the best ways to be introducing the concepts and teaching it? So you ask a question that we are also asking, I think, is the answer. Another question from the room? Or I can go to Swati. Hello.
Hi, Catherine, and it is so wonderful to see you again and listen to you again. First of all, going back to Brendan's question, there isn't a right concoction to teach critical realism, and as a novice critical realist, I've realized it the hard way. You have to really dive deep into your own area and your own problem, and then read around to sort of understand how you are contextualizing critical realism to your context. So there is not a right way. It is very difficult to teach it. So I agree with Catherine that it is a very difficult question to answer. I just wanted to draw attention to Catherine's work with respect to the framework that you had created, Catherine, with of course, I think Adam Nichols is there with that, that research paper.
Yeah.
I have used that research paper. I just wanted to share my insight on that, and then perhaps I'll ask a question to the second presenter. I am a novice critical realist, and I used that framework for my research proposal for my PhD, for my EdD, which is Education Doctorate from UCL, IOE. And that helped me in terms of understanding how am I going to be, in terms of understanding the process of it. I also understand the messiness of the whole process. There is also an element of non-linearity, like there is not straight way, okay, I start with methodology and then I go to social theory and so on and so forth. So what I realized was that there is a lot of messiness there. There is not a straight jacketed sort of an approach that can be used. So that is one of my experiences that I wanted to share with everybody here. If people are new to critical realism, those are the aspects those are the problems that they face. And the second problem that I faced was because it is so messy, you don't know where to start, you don't know what aspect of Bhaskar's theory will fit in, or will you use eventually. That clarity does not come in unless you really read well, and I'm still reading, so I still have to see what will work well with me. So that was a comment on the framework, Catherine, for you. The question for the second presenter, Christodoulou, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, pardon me if I'm not. You talked about specific condition yielding specific events and therefore resultant mechanisms, which helps you to understand the reasons why there was an anger in a student, let's say. So my question is, what made you decide to choose those specific conditions or those specific events, and why not some other events? And how do you know? The reason why I'm asking is I'm struggling with the same thing. The reason why I'm asking is because those specific events or those specific conditions are chosen by the researcher. So is there no, do you think that there is a bias there in when you choose those specific events and, you know, ignore the ones that you have not chosen for your research? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, events and conditions were not chosen by me. The style of analysis I propose, in some sense, I could call it a mixed method. First, we do a kind of inductive analysis as proposed by the authors of thematic analysis I presented before. I think that the qualitative data analysis has to be done through a CR framework. And according to these two authors, the end result is the dendrogram I presented. In that sense, were not chosen by me. It came up from the interviews fragments, from the narratives of the novice teachers' narrations. And then I use this as a base, as a framework in order to go to the truth table. It was not chosen by me, but I think that an advantage of the QCA methodology is that it can work deductively as well. And I think that this point is directly connected with what Karim said before regarding that the direction has to be both ways, in the sense that the research has to provide new theoretical directions. I think that we should not identify qualitative research with inductivism. This is a huge misunderstanding in my view, because at least in my department, at least in pedagogy and educational studies, qualitative research dominated by the constructivist paradigm is dominated by the reasoning of induction. I think that by theorizing conditions, we have the opportunity to bring to the fore new theoretical explanations about a specific phenomenon. Thank you.
So can I ask another question, please? Sorry. Yes. So would you say, so then how do you justify it to be qualitative? Because it seems like it is more towards a positivist paradigm, rather than being more constructivists or interpretivists. Like, how do you justify that?
It is not,
sorry if I'm...
Yes, I can answer to this. It is not neither positivist nor constructivism, because both parts of the research, the qualitative and the QCA, are guided by the critical realism. I mean that the data analysis in the qualitative part will be guided by the CR thematic analysis, for example. And then when we go to construct the truth table, we will specify the events. Events is a crucial parameter, a crucial component in order to theorize about mechanisms. Mechanisms do not fly over the place. They are activated under conditions. And this is an idea completely ignorant for the positivists. Is it clear?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, we've still got a few minutes left. So, do we have any other questions online or in the room? Or do we have an early mark and run up and get lunch before everybody else? I'm seeing nods in the room. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending this session today. And look forward to seeing you back wherever we end up after lunch. I think it's about an hour-long break. Isn't it? Yep. Okay, great. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Cheers. It's great. Thank you. Right. Yeah, no, it's
This one I was saying, question.
Thanks, Chair.
So I want to sort of. I think it's also the other way around. You should. Yeah, I would like to decide on the just